I want to go ahead and take a look at dynamic HTML. So I'm going to start with an empty HTML page. So just starting with my HTML template titled DHTML. And I'm going to have an external script file. And what I want to do is I want to kick off an initial JavaScript function. So I'll have my script, and I'll trigger the init method. And in the init method, what I want to do is I want to fill in some of the details of my HTML body. So I have a folder called DHTML, and then the file name being index.html. Okay, so the general setup is the body's empty at this point. I run my init method, and what I want to do is I want to create a tag and put it inside of the body. So in order to do that, I'm going to create a new file, dynamichtml.js. I'm going to have my init method. And in the init method, I want to create just an h1 tag and put it on the page so that we can see it. And I'm going to give myself a little more screen real estate here. And I'm going to resize my browser so we can see this. Okay, so dynamic HTML is not hard. There's not very many methods involved, but really what it is I need to be able to create HTML elements, and I need to position them on the screen where I want them. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I want to create an element. So I'm going to have h1 tag, and it's going to be created using document.createElement. And document.createElement takes a parameter, which is the type of tag that you want to create. So in our case, we want to create an h1 tag. What this does is it generates an empty h1 tag. Okay, so there's nothing in it, there's no text, there's no attributes, anything like that. Document.createElement will create any type of tag that you'd pass in. So if I want to create an h1 tag, or an input tag, or a form tag, or a button tag, any type of tag that I want to create, I use document.createElement, and it'll create that empty tag for me. Okay, so an empty HTML tag is not that exciting. So what I want to do is I want to set some text. I want to assign some text to this h1 tag. So one easy way to do that is just to set the inner HTML. I think most people will end up using this option, so I use cubstink. Okay, so it's saved. What's happening though is that in JavaScript I've created this h1 tag, and it's not visible to the user because I don't actually put it onto the HTML page. So if I go ahead and open this up in a browser, okay, so you'll notice that there is nothing there. And if I go inspect the page and I look at the elements, it's a little hard to see the elements because of the way I have this laid out. So let me resize that window. There we go. At some point it shifts. There we go. In the body, there's nothing there other than the init method. And you'll notice there is no h1 tag that's getting rendered. It just doesn't exist. Okay, I have the h1 tag. It's in my JavaScript code, but it's not in my HTML. So what I want to do is I want to position this in my HTML. The way I position elements in HTML, I almost always use the same method, which is append child, but it's append child relative to an existing element. So in our case, we want to append a child to the body. That's a reference element, so we want to append a child to the body. So the method that we're going to use is document.body.appendChild. And then we're going to put that h1 tag on the page for the user to see. So line 6 is actually when this becomes visible to the end user. Okay, so you'll see cubstink shows up now, and you'll also see in real time in the elements, this h1 tag now shows up. Okay. Okay, so then let's take this a step further. What if I had a heading section? So I start with a div with an ID equal to heading, and by default there's nothing in it, and I want to fill that in. Okay, so I have this div, it's a heading, it's empty, but what I want to do is I want to take the h1 tag that I created, And instead of appending it to the body, I want to append it to the heading. But before I do that, I want to just take a look at what's happening right now. So I'm going to go ahead and save everything. If I refresh it, what ends up happening is if I look at this, you'll see I have the heading and then the init method. This is what comes with the initial HTML when the initial HTML loads. And then you'll notice the dynamic HTML that I used to create this h1 tag that has cub stink in it, that is getting appended as the last child of body. So the heading is one child, the script is another child, and then the h1 tag gets appended as the last child. The append child method always works that way. Relative to this reference element, when I append a child, my element will always get appended as the last child. Always. Okay, so now we want to move forward. We want to take our h1 tag and put it inside this div with an ID of heading. So the way I want to do that is instead of using document.body as my reference element, I want to use the heading as my reference element. So I'm going to use document.querySelector. I'm going to go select the heading, and I'm going to append a child, my h1 tag. Okay, and if I refresh this, it doesn't look any different, but you'll notice that now this div with an ID of heading has this nesting relationship where my h1 tag now falls as a child of it. So my reference element is going to determine what the parent is of the child that I'm adding to the document. Okay. So let's talk about a couple of other things. So right now it's an h1 tag. There's not much nuance to it. What if I wanted to add some attributes to my h1 tag? So for instance, maybe I want to add a class. Okay, so there's a couple of ways to do that. Class is a little bit unique because a class is actually a keyword in JavaScript, even though there is no such thing as classes in JavaScript. But let's say I wanted to add a class. So I can do that using dot notation. And normally dot notation to assign an attribute will have a one-to-one match. The attribute name comes through to JavaScript, and then I would reference that attribute here in code. But class, like I said, is unique. So I don't just say class, I say class name. And I'm just going to call it my heading. Okay, and then what we'll see over here in dynamic HTML or in real time is that this h1 tag has a class. Okay, so that's one way to add attributes. Another way to add attributes besides dot notation is I could use setAttribute. So I could say I want the class to be my heading. And I know a few of you are going to have the question right away. I can have multiple classes here. Okay, so now I have 3 classes for my h1 tag. So I have my heading, I have another, and then I have class is all 3 separate classes applied to that h1 tag. Okay, I can do this for any attribute. So if I want to set an ID for this h1 tag, h1 set attribute ID my custom ID. Okay, so you'll notice that the ID is there. Another thing that I might use attributes for is I might use attributes to store data about my HTML elements. So for instance, let's say the user was interacting with my page and they click a button, and because of that some results show up on my page, and I might be using that to have like a running total or a calculator or something like that. I might want to store data inside of my HTML tags that I generate. So typically the way that's going to happen is I can use this to set an attribute. So for instance, like data.price or data-price, and I can make that some custom value, $10.50 for instance. Okay, and if I go ahead and run this, you'll see that my heading now has a data price equal to $10.50. Okay, so one concept with this is data price is not an HTML attribute. It's something I made up. It has nothing to do with the h1 tag. I might just be using that to store metadata about this h1 tag. Anytime I'm using my own custom attributes, I'll typically hyphenate this as data dash, and then whatever that field or that value is going to be, so that key value pair, so data dash price or data dash height, data dash um, cost. Okay, so there's a bunch of different ways I might store data. But typically, if I'm going to have my own custom attributes, I'll use that data dash notation to indicate that this is a custom element. Okay, so right now we can create elements. We can set text with those elements. We can set attributes. And then we have a very basic understanding of how I would append an element to the page. So if I just use my reference element dot append child, what I can do is I can append a child as the last child to this HTML document. Okay, I run into issues if I have a more complicated situation. So for instance, let us say I had a div with an ID equal to content, and then a div with an ID equal to footer. Okay, so I have three different sections, and I want to, let's say I wanted to create an element and I wanted to position it right here on line 10. I would run into a problem or a limitation of the append child method. Okay, so if I try to append a child, I could try to use the body as my reference element, but if I append a child to the body, I'm going to append my element as the last child, meaning I'm going to append it after this footer. If I pick any of the other elements, so heading, content, or footer, and use those as my reference elements, I'm going to have a nesting relationship. And that's not what I want either. I want to, after the heading, so after the closing div tag of my heading, I want to add a new element on line 10. And at this point with append child, I've run into a limitation. So because append child always adds my element as the last child to whatever the reference element is, I can't do what I want to do here. So in the next video on dynamic HTML, we'll talk about other approaches in terms of how do we position elements differently other than append child.